You think soul food has always looked the same? Think again. The 1960s were a golden era for African American cooking, dishes born from church suppers and family tables that time has nearly erased. Let's dig into 2 hours of 60 African American recipes from the 1960s we want back. Shelf-stable rice was bought in bulk whenever families could spare the money, because rice stretched everything. A single pot filled stomachs, thickened soups, extended stews, and paired with beans in a way that turned simple ingredients into complete meals. Rice never spoiled if stored dry and sealed, which made it one of the safest pantry investments during the Depression. Mothers measured it carefully, knowing exactly how much was needed to feed everyone without wasting a grain. Kids often carried the bags home from the store, feeling like they were holding something important. Rice anchored dinners when there was no meat, no vegetables, and no time. Families relied on rice for steady comfort, day after day, pot after pot. And beyond filling bellies, rice provided emotional comfort, a sense that even on the leanest nights, there would still be something warm to eat. Elders taught younger generations the art of rinsing, simmering, and stretching rice, turning a single pot into the foundation of an entire meal. Rice became a symbol of reliability, proof that simple foods could keep families strong through the hardest seasons. Boiled peanuts were a beloved snack in Southern African American communities, often tied to slow afternoons on porches or roadside stands. Fresh green peanuts were simmered for hours in salted water, sometimes with cayenne or garlic, until tender and flavorful. Their soft, briny taste made them completely unlike roasted peanuts and best eaten warm straight from the pot. Harvest season often brought families together around big stock pots, chatting while peeling open the damp shells to reveal the tender beans. Selling boiled peanuts along rural roads became both a seasonal tradition and a small source of income. Inexpensive, filling, and easy to make in large batches, they were perfect for festivals, gatherings, or casual visits. While they remain a cherished regional treat in some areas, their everyday presence has faded, leaving behind a nostalgic reminder of communal cooking, patience, and turning humble harvests into something truly worth savoring. Lends flair to potlucks and bake sales, filling kitchens with the warm perfume of brown sugar and butter. A buttery shortbread crust was pressed into a pan and baked until just firm before being topped with a gooey mixture of chopped pecans, cream, and dark brown sugar. As it baked again, the topping bubbled into a caramel-like layer that set into chewy sweetness with a hint of nutty crunch. Each square delivered the flavor of classic Southern pralines in an easy-to-share form, perfect for coffee hours and church gatherings. Children loved licking the sticky syrup from their fingers, while adults reached for second and third pieces without apology. In the 1970s, these bars offered a bridge between candy making and home baking, capturing the indulgent spirit of Louisiana without the need for a candy thermometer. Pecan praline bars proved that a little Southern magic and a handful of pecans could turn an ordinary afternoon into a festival of sweetness worth every bite. Butter pecan ice cream was the homemade reward for hot summer. Wild rice pudding combined indigenous grains with African-inspired preparation to create a dish both nourishing and subtly sweet. Wild rice grew naturally in shallow lakes and slow rivers, and enslaved families near these wetlands harvested the dark grains with paddles and baskets, drying them in the sun for year-round use. Cooked slowly in water until tender, the rice was stirred with a bit of sorghum syrup or honey if available, making a warm pudding that supplied protein and lasting energy. Its nutty flavor and satisfying texture turned a simple bowl into a special treat, especially when fresh fruit or spices could be added. This recipe carried forward after emancipation as African American cooks continued to value wild rice for festive meals and family gatherings. Modern chefs still celebrate its earthy richness, but the story behind wild rice pudding honors the blend of native and African foodways that sustained people through scarcity and created a dessert that is at once humble and deeply rooted in the shared history of America's wetlands and kitchens. Stewed oxtails with rice gravy brought deep flavor and slow-cooked richness to Sunday tables across many African American communities. Oxtails, once inexpensive and overlooked, were browned in heavy pots and then simmered for hours with onions, garlic, and spices until the meat turned buttery soft. The braising liquid thickened into a silky gravy that clung to each grain of rice, creating a dish that was equal parts comfort and celebration. Families saved this meal for weekends when everyone could gather because patience was essential and conversation flowed while the pot worked its magic. Children sneaked tastes from wooden spoons, drawn by the savory aroma that filled the house from morning until evening. The humble tale, once discarded by butchers, became a centerpiece of pride and ingenuity. Today, rising prices and faster cooking habits mean fewer people take the time to coax such tenderness from a simple cut of beef, but those who remember the meal speak of it as a perfect union of thrift, skill, and the slow rhythm of family life. Pork cracklin cornbread was a dish that made even a simple pan of bread feel like a celebration. Cracklins, small crispy bits left from rendering pork fat, were cheap to come by and packed with flavor. My grandmother folded them into cornbread batter, the fat melting and the crunchy pieces scattering through every slice. Baked until golden, it came out hearty and rich, with texture that plain cornbread never had. The salty pork balanced the sweet cornmeal, making each bite feel indulgent even though the ingredients were inexpensive. Families sliced it thick and ate it alone or alongside beans, greens, or stews, letting the cracklins carry the flavor of meat through the whole meal. In the 1960s, this kind of dish made families feel proud, as though they had something special on the table despite the hardships around them. Pork cracklin cornbread was thrift turned into joy, simple food lifted by the spirit of making do. Cracklings collected after rendering pork were tiny pieces of concentrated flavor families treated like treasure. When a pig was butchered, every scrap mattered, and the fat was slowly rendered down to make lard, a kitchen essential. What floated to the top and hardened into crisp little bits were the cracklings. Families saved them in tins, sprinkling them into cornbread, greens, or potatoes to stretch flavor when real meat was too expensive to buy. Kids snacked on them warm, crunching down on something salty and rich enough to feel like a luxury. Cracklings reminded families that nothing should ever be wasted. They turned ordinary dishes into something satisfying, giving food depth even when ingredients were scarce. During the Depression, those little pieces of pork kept meals from tasting empty, carrying the weight of both flavor and tradition. They also became a quiet symbol of gratitude, proof that even the smallest leftovers could bring a burst of joy into kitchens that rarely saw abundance. Elders treated cracklings with respect, storing them carefully, as if they were worth far more than they cost. And in many ways, they were cracklings connected families to the land, the animal, and the knowledge that survival depended on using every last thing with intention. Cowpea and collard stew combined two powerhouse ingredients that sustained countless families through hard times. Field peas, also known as cowpeas, were simmered slowly with smoky meat and joined by hearty collard greens, creating a dish rich in protein, vitamins, and earthy flavor. The long cooking process filled homes with an aroma that signaled comfort and nourishment. Farmers valued cowpeas for their ability to thrive in poor soil, while collards offered leaves long after other vegetables had withered. Together, they made a meal that cost little but fed many, reflecting a tradition of resourcefulness and care. Mothers and grandmothers seasoned the pot with onions, garlic, and pepper, each adding a personal touch passed down through generations. Families gathered around the table with slices of cornbread to soak up the flavorful broth, finding strength in every spoonful. Though supermarkets now offer endless choices, the slow-simmered union of cowpeas and collards stands as a reminder of a time when simple ingredients created enduring nourishment. Fatback fried cabbage was a simple, deeply satisfying dish that turned a humble head of cabbage into a flavorful side worth remembering. Fatback, a cured slab of pork fat with a rich, salty taste, was diced and fried until it released its golden drippings. Into this savory base went shredded cabbage, sizzling as it hit the hot pan and slowly softening while soaking up all the flavor. The edges browned slightly, giving a hint of caramelization, while the tender leaves carried the smoky richness of the pork. This was a dish that needed no complicated seasoning, just salt, pepper, and sometimes a splash of vinegar to brighten the flavors. In African American kitchens, especially in the rural South, fatback fried cabbage was an easy way to feed a family, served alongside cornbread and beans or as part of a larger spread. It represented the practice of using every part of what was available, from the vegetables in the garden to the trimmings from a butchered hog. Today, while cabbage is still common, the tradition of frying it in fatback has faded, replaced by lighter cooking methods, but its flavor remains unforgettable to those who grew up eating it. That tasted far richer than its modest origins. Eggs, sugar, butter, and tangy buttermilk whisked together into a smooth filling that baked in a single crust until the surface browned lightly and the center set to a creamy consistency. The slight tang of the buttermilk balanced the sweetness, making each bite both comforting and intriguing. African American families in the 1970s valued the recipe for its thrift and reliability, knowing that even in lean times, a luxurious dessert was within reach. Served warm or chilled, plain or with a scattering of fresh berries, buttermilk pie delighted guests without demanding complicated techniques or expensive ingredients. Its enduring charm lay in the way it brought people together around something humble yet special. Each slice carried the quiet satisfaction of resourcefulness and tradition, a reminder that the heart of hospitality often rests in the simplest, most lovingly prepared dishes shared at the end of a long meal. Pine needle tea offered a bright and restorative drink when fresh produce was scarce during cold months. Enslaved foragers collected the youngest green needles from longleaf and loblolly pines, rinsed them carefully, and steeped them in hot water until the brew released a light citrus aroma. Rich in vitamin C, this tea helped ward off scurvy and brought a welcome freshness to winter diets heavy with salt-preserved foods. The practice echoed both indigenous traditions and West African herbal knowledge, merging two continents' wisdom into a single sustaining cup. Families continued to brew pine needle tea well after emancipation, and it remains popular among modern herbalists for its gentle flavor and reputed immune-boosting qualities. Its evergreen scent and warm golden color remind us that even in the most barren season, the forest offered nourishment. Pine needle tea illustrates how observing the land and respecting its cycles allowed people to find both medicine and comfort, turning what others overlooked into a sustaining daily ritual that strengthened body and spirit alike. Homemade crackling bread filled kitchens with the savory perfume of pork fat and toasted cornmeal. Families saved every scrap of rendered pork skin, frying it until crisp and then folding the cracklings into cornbread batter rich with buttermilk and a touch of lard. Baked in a well-seasoned skillet, the bread emerged with a crisp crust and pockets of salty crunch that delighted children and elders alike. It was a dish born of necessity, ensuring nothing from the hog went to waste, but it also became a treat that people looked forward to at Sunday dinners. Neighbors often traded cracklings after a hog killing, turning the preparation into a social event that celebrated thrift and flavor. Today, store-bought cornbread mixes rarely capture the depth or texture of the old-style cracklin' bread, and few families still render their own pork. For those who have tasted it, the memory of that smoky, savory slice remains a reminder of community resourcefulness and the joy of making something extraordinary from humble ingredients. Stewed field peas with cornbread was a Southern staple that seemed to appear on tables no matter how hard times got. Field peas were inexpensive, easy to grow, and dried well enough to last through seasons, making them a dependable ingredient when other food was scarce. My grandmother simmered them slowly with onion, maybe a scrap of pork if any was left, until the peas broke down into a thick, savory stew. Cornbread was baked alongside, crumbly and warm, and served as the perfect companion, soaking up every bit of broth. Together they made a full meal, packed with enough substance to keep workers fed after long days in the fields or factories. Field peas were humble compared to black-eyed peas or butter beans, but they carried a taste of the land, earthy and comforting. For families with little money to spare, this pairing was dependable, stretching across generations as a dish of both necessity and pride. Stewed field peas with cornbread filled stomachs, warmed hearts, and reminded everyone that simple food could still be good food. Dried pumpkin ropes were a symbol of patience and practicality, a way to stretch one harvest into many months of meals. Strips of pumpkin flesh were cut thin with worn knives and hung near the fire to dry, curling into long ropes that hardened in the smoke and heat. These strands could be stored for months, waiting to be dropped into stews to thicken broth or soften into porridge. Pumpkin was plentiful after harvest, but fresh produce never lasted long, especially under the strain of forced labor and limited access to land. Drying it was the answer, transforming something fleeting into something enduring. The faint sweetness of rehydrated pumpkin added depth to meals made mostly from grains or roots. The ropes hung from rafters like garlands of survival, bright orange reminders that foresight and resourcefulness were as valuable as any spice. It was food that carried memory and the quiet discipline of those who refused to starve. Molasses coffee was not fancy, but it was strong enough to keep a person going through the longest of days. When coffee beans were scarce and sugar even scarcer, someone clever discovered that a spoonful of blackstrap molasses stirred into hot water or weak brew could make a drink both sweet and smoky. The result was thick and dark, with a bitterness that clung to the tongue and warmed the chest. It tasted like work and resilience, like fields at sunrise and factory bells ringing. Families drank it early and often, some adding milk if fortune allowed, others taking it plain with bread crusts for breakfast. It was a poor man's luxury, a small rebellion against hunger and fatigue. The smell alone was enough to wake the tired and remind them that strength could be stirred, not bought. Molasses coffee was courage in a cup, shared by hands cracked from labor and hearts that refused to quit. It carried the spirit of people who built their mornings out of willpower and steam, proving that dignity could live even in the thinnest brew. Rendered lard stored in tins was pure gold in Depression kitchens, especially in African American households that knew how to stretch every resource: lard-fried chicken, seasoned beans, flavored greens, baked biscuits, and made pie crusts flaky, even when butter was a distant dream. Families saved every bit of fat they could, rendering it slow until it turned liquid, then letting it cool into a smooth white block that lasted for weeks. A spoonful added richness to meals that otherwise would have tasted plain. Grandmothers guarded their lard tins like treasure because they understood just how far it could go. In a time when nothing was wasted, lard became one of the most valuable ingredients in the home, turning scraps and basics into meals that felt whole. Charred sweet cornmeal cakes were the traveler's food, built for endurance, not pleasure. The batter of ground corn, salt, and water was poured thin and cooked until crisp and dark, intentionally over-roasted to make the cakes last longer without spoiling. They were tough, smoky, and dry, but when soaked in broth or water, they softened into hearty meals again. Portable and durable, they could be wrapped in cloth and carried for days. For those who worked long hours away from fire or kitchen, these cakes were essential fuel, simple, sturdy, and reliable. The char was not a flaw but a strategy, sealing in flavor and strength. Each cake told a story of discipline, of people who could not afford to waste a grain. The smell of roasted corn was familiar and grounding, a link between past and present laborers. Each bite was proof of cleverness, born from need, a reminder that even the humblest ingredients could sustain great endurance. These cakes may not have been festive or soft, but they were food that traveled with you through struggle and survival alike, feeding body and will across endless miles of hardship. Ham bone soup with vegetables was one of those meals where one piece of meat flavored an entire pot. A single ham bone, stripped of most of its meat, simmered for hours with onions, carrots, and potatoes until the broth turned rich and smoky. My grandmother would add beans or greens if she had them, letting the flavors meld into something far more substantial than the ingredients suggested. Families gathered around steaming bowls, dipping bread into the broth and savoring the flavor the bone had left behind. It was frugal cooking at its finest, taking scraps and stretching them into nourishment. The soup fed many mouths, warmed cold nights, and made do with what was available. In the 1960s, when meat was costly, a ham bone could be the centerpiece of dinner, proving that thrift and patience could coax flavor out of nearly anything. Ham bone soup with vegetables carried both practicality and comfort in every ladleful. Bars were the sticky sweet treasures of church bake sales and weekend coffee hours. A simple base of yellow cake mix formed the bottom layer, pressed into a pan to create a soft crust. The topping combined cream cheese, powdered sugar, and eggs into a rich custard that baked into a slightly crisp surface while staying deliciously gooey beneath. Cut into neat squares once cooled, they delivered a sweet rush that paired perfectly with strong coffee or a cold glass of milk. Children loved the melt-in-your-mouth texture, while adults appreciated the effortless preparation and crowd-pleasing flavor. In the 1970s, these bars spread quickly through community cookbooks and potluck tables, their irresistible combination of convenience and indulgence making them a near-constant presence. Chess squares proved that simplicity could be decadent, offering a dessert so rich and satisfying that one bite was never enough, ensuring their place in the memories of countless family gatherings and joyful kitchen conversations. Cherry Jubilee. She crab soup was a rich, velvety bisque tied closely to Gullah Geechee coastal traditions, made with fresh crab meat and the delicate roe from female crabs. The roe gave the soup a distinctive orange hue and depth of flavor that could not be replicated with substitutes. Simmered slowly with butter, cream, and a touch of sherry, it was a dish served for special occasions or to honor guests. Its origins trace back to Charleston kitchens, where African-American cooks perfected the technique, balancing sweetness from the crab with the savory cream base. Served piping hot, often with a sprinkle of fresh parsley, it was both a comfort and a luxury. Overfishing, rising costs, and changes in seafood sourcing have made authentic she crab soup rare, leaving it as a treasured memory for those who once knew the joy of its silky texture and briny, ocean-rich flavor. Ash cake bread was born out of fire and hunger, a recipe that came alive in the heart of hard times. Cornmeal, salt, and water were all it needed. The dough was pressed together by hand and buried right into the hot ashes of a wood fireplace. It baked slowly, the outside hardening into a smoky crust, while the inside stayed soft, golden, and warm. When it came out, people brushed away the ashes, broke it open, and drizzled it with syrup or molasses. It had a taste that was both sweet and earthy, like the memory of home on a Sunday morning. Ash cake bread was a working person's meal, something you could make after a long day without needing an oven or a fancy pan. It was food that did not waste or wait, made for those who had nothing extra but still found comfort in what little they had. The smell of it filled small cabins and quiet kitchens, the sound of the crackling fire mixing with laughter or prayer. Every crumb reminded people that strength could grow even from ashes. Dried fish from local creeks was a resource many African American families relied on when money could not stretch far enough for fresh meat. Fishermen salted the catch heavily, then hung it to dry in smoke or sun, creating a protein that lasted weeks without refrigeration. This fish was rehydrated in stews, fried in small pieces, or flaked into hash with potatoes. It smelled strong but tasted rich, filling the role of meat when meat simply was not an option. Drying fish required time, patience, and knowledge passed between generations. It was a tradition born from necessity and shaped by the environment. Families guarded these pieces carefully, knowing each strip could anchor multiple meals. When pots simmered with dried fish, the aroma meant dinner would be satisfying, even if ingredients were simple. It was survival shaped by water, fire, salt, and skill. That fish represented self-reliance, something pulled from nature, transformed by human hands, and stretched to nourish as many mouths as possible. Kids watched their elders clean, salt, and hang the fish, learning not just a recipe but a way of life built on resourcefulness. Dried fish was more than food. It was a lesson in endurance, pride, and making the most of what the world offered. Fried fish heads utilized parts that others threw away, transforming waste into protein-rich meals through skillful preparation. When Black families caught or bought fish, Nothing edible was discarded. Heads were cleaned, seasoned, and fried until crispy. The cheeks contained tender, sweet meat prized by those who knew to look for it. Eyes and bits of flesh around the skull provided precious protein during times when every calorie mattered. These fish heads were dredged in cornmeal and fried in hot lard until the bones turned crispy enough to crunch and eat. Children learned to navigate around bones, finding hidden bits of meat while developing appreciation for resourcefulness. In coastal communities and near rivers, fish heads appeared regularly because commercial fisheries sold them cheaply or gave them away. Black cooks fried them alongside regular fish, treating them with the same care and seasoning. The practice showed intimate knowledge of food, understanding that value existed everywhere if you knew how to prepare it properly through creative survival. Hoe cakes were more than just cornmeal pancakes. They were a connection to labor, history, and home. Made from a simple batter of cornmeal, water, and a pinch of salt, they were cooked on flat iron griddles, skillets, or even the flat side of a hoe blade over an open fire. This made them quick to prepare in the fields or at home, perfect for feeding hungry workers. Hoe cakes had a crisp edge, soft center, and a flavor that paired well with everything from syrup to savory stews. In African American history, they represented sustenance during long days and ingenuity in cooking methods. They could be eaten for breakfast, lunch, or dinner, depending on what was available to serve alongside them. While modern kitchens have replaced open fires, the memory of hoe cakes remains tied to family stories and community meals. Their simplicity made them timeless, yet their presence on tables today is far less common than it once was. Dramatic color and smooth tang to every celebration during the 1970s. The batter, tinted with just enough cocoa and a splash of red food coloring, baked into striking crimson layers that contrasted beautifully with the snowy frosting. Cream cheese whipped with butter and powdered sugar provided a silky finish that balanced the cake's subtle chocolate flavor with gentle tang. Each slice looked like a piece of art on a plate, making it a favorite for church anniversaries, wedding receptions, and holiday feasts. The recipe's origins carried whispers of both Southern tradition and a growing national fascination with bold presentation. Serving red velvet cake was a statement of style and hospitality, a way to show guests that a little extra effort could create something unforgettable. Families treasured the excitement it brought to the dessert table, proving that a dash of color and a touch of cream cheese could transform a simple cake into an icon of joy and celebration. Coconut sheet cake was the ground pumpkin seed. Porridge transformed leftover seeds into a hearty meal that supplied both protein and healthy oils. After pumpkins were cooked for pies or stews, the seeds were washed, dried, and pounded into a coarse meal. This meal was simmered slowly in water or thin milk, creating a creamy porridge with a subtle nutty flavor. Sweetened lightly with honey or molasses when available, it became a sustaining breakfast or evening dish that used every part of the harvest. The method reflected West African culinary traditions where ground seeds thickened soups and stews, showing how transplanted knowledge enriched American foodways. Generations after emancipation, pumpkin seed porridge remained a seasonal specialty in some rural areas, appreciated for its nourishing qualities and gentle taste. Modern cooks might recognize it in contemporary seed-based milks and cereals, proving that this centuries-old practice still influences how we eat today. Ground pumpkin seed porridge highlights the wisdom of never wasting what nature provides and celebrates a heritage of careful resourcefulness that continues to inspire. Shepherd's pie with mashed sweet potatoes was a clever twist on an old classic that fit the budget of Black families in the 1960s. Instead of pricey white potatoes, sweet potatoes from the garden were boiled, mashed, and spread on top of a filling made from scraps of meat and vegetables. My grandmother would use whatever was left, bits of beef, chicken, or even pork, chopped small and cooked with onions, carrots, or peas until it formed a savory base. The sweet potato topping baked into a golden layer that balanced the salty meat with a touch of natural sweetness. It was hearty enough to fill everyone, but cheap enough to make even during lean weeks. Sweet potatoes were plentiful in many southern gardens, and they stretched farther than most vegetables because they were filling and rich in flavor. Shepherd's pie with mashed sweet potatoes was more than just food. It was a statement of ingenuity. Families made do with what they had and still put something warm and comforting on the table. That golden crust represented thrift and care, carrying both survival and love in every spoonful. Crushed oyster shell lime was survival ingenuity disguised as chemistry. Oysters, abundant along the southern coast, provided more than food. Their shells were burned or ground to make lime, which could be used to cure meats, preserve vegetables, or supplement diets lacking calcium. The process was slow and smoky. Shells collected, crushed, and heated until they turned white and brittle. The powder that remained was mixed into brine or rubbed onto food before storage. It could even be used to whiten walls or patch small cracks in chimneys, turning waste into utility in every sense. For those denied access to medical care or proper nutrition, this humble material offered health and preservation alike. The smell of burning shells lingered in the air, marking the intersection of hardship and invention. It was the science of necessity, born not in laboratories but in the open air by those who learned to read nature's laws through need. Even waste became resource. The oyster shell stood as a small testament to wisdom gathered from both land and sea, proof that nothing in survival was ever truly thrown away, and that even what was discarded could build the foundation of endurance. Black walnut pound cake carried the wild woods straight into the holiday kitchen with a perfume unlike any other. Foragers collected the hard-shelled nuts each autumn, cracking them carefully to release the dark, robust kernels inside. The cake batter, rich with butter and eggs, absorbed the strong, earthy flavor of the walnuts, baking into a loaf dense enough to slice thin and savor slowly. Served at Christmas or family reunions, the cake announced both celebration and the success of gathering nature's bounty. Children helped shell the nuts, their hands stained brown from the husks, a seasonal badge of honor. Neighbors traded slices wrapped in wax paper as gifts, spreading cheer through the community. Today, imported walnuts and commercial cakes have replaced the ritual, but the memory of that deep, almost smoky taste lingers for those who once enjoyed a slice with coffee while snow fell outside and the house smelled of spice and toasting nuts. Fish head stew was a dish born out of necessity, yet it carried surprising depth and flavor. Fish heads, often discarded by others, were simmered slowly with onions, potatoes, and rice until they yielded every ounce of richness to the broth. My grandmother insisted the heads made the stew better than fillies, providing body and nourishment that nothing else could. The bones and skin flavored the liquid until it turned hearty and comforting. Potatoes stretched the meal, rice thickened it, and vegetables added substance, turning scraps into a filling supper. The taste was strong, earthy, and unforgettable, reminding everyone that no part of food should go unused. For Black families in the 1960s, fish head stew was a common way to stretch the catch of the day, ensuring nothing went to waste. It became a lesson in thrift and gratitude, proof that survival demanded creativity. Fish head stew was both humble and mighty, sustaining families through lean times with flavor and tradition. Roasted gourd seeds turned the remnants of pumpkins and native gourds into a vital source of fat and minerals. After the flesh was cooked for soups or pies, seeds were washed, lightly salted, and spread near the hearth to dry before roasting. This simple preparation produced a crunchy, nutrient-rich snack that stored well through the winter and could be ground into meal or used to thicken stews. Similar seed roasting traditions existed across West Africa, where pumpkin and melon seeds were prized for both flavor and nutrition, and those techniques crossed the Atlantic with enslaved people. Over time, roasted pumpkin seeds became a familiar autumn treat in American households, sold at fairs and enjoyed during harvest celebrations. The practice illustrates how African culinary memory merged with indigenous crops, creating a food that moved from necessity to seasonal pleasure. Roasted gourd seeds continue to appear in modern kitchens and farmers markets, carrying with them the history of careful saving and the resourceful spirit that turned every part of the plant into nourishment. Mustard greens with smoked turkey offered a flavorful, lighter take on the classic pot of greens traditionally cooked with pork. The peppery greens were simmered slowly with smoked turkey wings or legs, releasing a deep, savory aroma as the broth grew rich and seasoned. The turkey meat, tender and falling from the bone, infused every leaf with smoky depth. The potlikker, or cooking liquid, was prized on its own, perfect for dipping warm cornbread. In African American kitchens, smoked turkey became a popular choice in later decades for those seeking a leaner protein without sacrificing tradition. The dish was a staple at Sunday dinners, reunions, and holidays, bringing families together over steaming bowls. Long simmering ensured the greens were soft and deeply flavored. While still made today, convenience foods have replaced the slow, careful preparation in many homes, leaving this version a reminder of patience, community, and soulful cooking. Okra fritters with corn silk were the kind of kitchen magic that only came from necessity and imagination. In the long summer months, when the fields were full and money was not, people used every part of what they harvested. The corn silk that clung to the ears was not thrown away, but saved and shredded, added into batter alongside chopped okra, flour, and a splash of milk or water. When dropped into hot oil, the fritters puffed and crackled, their edges turning golden and crisp. The smell was something you could follow from down the road. Warm, nutty, and sweet with that faint scent of corn. Each bite was crunchy on the outside and tender in the middle, with little strings of corn silk that gave it texture and charm. They were served with syrup or vinegar, depending on what the family had, eaten right out of the pan when patience ran out. Okra fritters with corn silk were food born from care and cleverness, proof that waste had no place in a humble kitchen. Every family had its own version, passed quietly between generations, carrying the taste of late afternoons, hard work, and simple joy. They were poverty's poetry, fried into something worth remembering. Leftover bones saved for broth were one of the greatest acts of Depression-era ingenuity. When meat was a rarity, bones were never thrown away. They were the foundation of meals. Grandmothers simmered them for hours with onions, scraps of vegetables, and whatever seasoning they had, pulling every bit of flavor from bone to water. The result was a rich, savory broth that fed families across several meals. Rice, dumplings, or vegetables added to the pot created dishes that tasted far more generous than the ingredients allowed. Bones could be reused more than once, simmered again until every trace of nourishment had been pulled free. This was not just frugality, it was survival passed down through generations, where even the barest ingredients could become a pot of comfort. Families gathered around bowls of broth that warmed bodies and spirits after long days of hard work. Children learned early that bones carried more value than they appeared to, holding flavor that could be coaxed out with patience and care. These broths formed the backbone of many Depression-era dishes, quietly proving that resourcefulness could turn almost nothing into something sustaining. Sun-baked clay pot beans were born from ingenuity and necessity, slow-cooked by the earth itself when firewood was scarce or forbidden. Beans were soaked overnight, sealed in clay pots with water, herbs, and bits of fat if they were lucky enough to have some. The pots were buried shallow in sun-warmed soil or left near smoldering embers to cook slowly through the day. The result was tender, smoky beans that carried the flavor of the land and the resilience of those who made them. Cooking this way saved precious wood and kept smoke from betraying their fires. It was quiet cooking, careful cooking, born from both wisdom and the need to survive unseen. When the pots were unearthed at dusk, the beans were hearty enough to feed several people, filling the belly and steadying the heart. In a world built on taking, this was a small act of keeping, of making something nourishing from the warmth of the ground itself. Chicken wing stew was one of those meals that would surprise modern ears, since wings were once the cheapest part of the bird. My grandmother bought them in bulk when she could, piling them into pots with onions, celery, and carrots. Slowly simmered, the wings gave up their fat and flavor, turning thin broth into rich gravy. She thickened it with flour or cornstarch, serving it hot over rice or bread to stretch it even further. It was messy eating, but no one complained because the taste was so comforting. Wings may be prized today, but in the 1960s they were scraps, turned into nourishment by clever hands. She said every part of the bird had value if you treated it with respect. Chicken wing stew carried the spirit of thrift, transforming what others dismissed into something that filled the house with warmth. It was proof that good cooking did not depend on wealth, only patience and care. Homemade cane. Syrup drizzle once gave biscuits and pancakes a dark, smoky sweetness unmatched by refined sugar. Families would harvest sugarcane, crush the stalks, and boil the juice in large iron kettles until it thickened into a rich amber syrup. The work was hot and sticky, often stretching from dawn until late night, but the reward was a flavor that defined Southern breakfasts and holiday treats. Children watched the bubbling kettles with wide eyes, waiting for a chance to taste the warm syrup on a fresh biscuit. Neighbors often shared the labor and the finished product, turning the syrup-making into a community event as well as a culinary one. Over time, industrial sweeteners and store-bought syrups replaced the careful craft, and the knowledge of how to coax sweetness from cane faded with older generations. For those who remember, a spoonful of homemade cane syrup is more than a taste. It is a memory of family unity, hard work, and the sweetness that perseverance can bring. Burdock root stew speaks to the deep botanical knowledge carried by African cooks who could read the land for nourishment even when fields were bare. Burdock, a hardy root with a flavor similar to earthy artichoke, grew wild along fence rows and shaded ditches where other crops refused to thrive. Gatherers dug the long taproots with simple hand tools, scrubbed them clean, and sliced them thin before simmering them for hours with any garden greens or herbs that might be on hand. The slow cooking softened the root into a tender base for a broth that was both filling and rich in minerals. This practice echoed African and indigenous traditions of using wild roots as a staple during lean times. After emancipation, burdock continued to appear in rural foraging guides and folk remedies, admired for its subtle sweetness and sustaining qualities. Today, herbalists still value burdock for its nutrients, reminding us that what once served as a quiet survival food remains a symbol of resourcefulness and a connection to the untamed landscape of the American South. Banana pudding with vanilla wafers delivered pure comfort in a chilled dish that always seemed to disappear before anyone could ask for seconds. Ripe bananas were sliced thin and layered with crisp vanilla wafers and creamy custard made from milk, eggs, and a hint of vanilla bean. Each layer softened as the pudding rested, allowing the cookies to turn cake-like while the bananas infused the custard with gentle sweetness. A crown of meringue or whipped cream sealed the top, lightly browned in the oven or served fresh from the refrigerator depending on family tradition. Sunday dinners and church socials alike relied on this dessert to close the meal with something cool, sweet, and familiar. Children loved sneaking extra wafers, while adults traded stories over heaping spoonfuls. Banana pudding with vanilla wafers captured the heart of community gatherings in the 1970s, proving that the simplest combination of fruit, cream, and cookies could create a dessert experience that felt luxurious, comforting, and timeless all at once. Red velvet cake with cream cheese frosting brought potatoes stored in burlap sacks were the dependable backbone of winter meals because potatoes were cheap, filling, and nearly impossible to ruin in storage. Families kept sacks in cool corners of cellars, checking them occasionally to remove any that softened. Potatoes became fries, mashed dishes, stews, hash, and even bread when flour ran low. They kept stomachs full when little else could. Children learned early how to scrub them clean, peel them thin, and help with dinner. Potatoes carried families through the Depression with quiet reliability. They offered endless versatility, fitting into every meal of the day without complaint. A single sack could feed a household for weeks, turning scarcity into sustenance and uncertainty into something manageable. Potatoes were dependable in a way few ingredients were. They sprouted slowly, stored easily, and transformed into whatever a meal needed. Families leaned on them heavily, grateful for a food that stretched, adapted, and never failed. In kitchens stretched thin by hardship, potatoes were stability in edible form. Pig feet and collard greens brought together two ingredients that white society dismissed, but black communities transformed into soul-satisfying meals. Pig feet, boiled until tender and gelatinous, released collagen that thickened cooking liquid into rich, silky broth. Collard greens, tough and bitter when raw, simmered in that broth for hours until they turned tender and deeply flavored. The combination created a pot of food that could feed 8 people for under 50 cents during Depression years. Black cooks added vinegar and hot peppers to cut through the richness, creating layers of flavor that made each bite interesting despite simple ingredients. In sharecropping communities, this dish appeared regularly because both ingredients were readily available. Pigs provided feet even when better cuts went to landowners, and collards grew abundantly in gardens. The potlikker left behind was considered as valuable as the greens themselves, sopped up with cornbread or saved for cooking rice. Children learned to appreciate pig feet's unique texture, the meat slipping off bones and the skin turning silky after long cooking despite crushing poverty. Liver and onions with pan gravy paired the deep, earthy flavor of seared beef liver with the gentle sweetness of caramelized onions for a meal that was hearty and nourishing. It was once a staple in many African American homes, especially in rural communities, valued for its affordability and high iron content. After the liver was browned, the pan drippings were turned into a rich brown gravy, thickened with flour and seasoned with salt and pepper. Served with mashed potatoes or rice, it offered comfort and satisfaction. While the strong flavor of liver wasn't for everyone, those who grew up with it often carried the taste into adulthood. In the days before easy access to costly cuts of meat, liver provided an accessible protein source that fit a waste-not approach to cooking, ensuring no part of the animal went unused, and every meal was as filling as it was purposeful. Sweet potato pie carried the soul of family tradition to every holiday table, its earthy sweetness and warm spices making it an unshakable favorite. Roasted sweet potatoes were mashed to a silky smoothness, blended with brown sugar, butter, eggs, and a hint of vanilla and cinnamon. Poured into a flaky homemade crust, the filling baked until the surface set with a gentle wobble, and the scent of spice filled the house. Served with or without a dollop of whipped cream, it embodied the essence of Southern comfort and African heritage. In the 1970s, no Thanksgiving or Christmas felt complete without at least one of these pies cooling on the counter, ready to be sliced after a hearty dinner. Grandmothers passed down secret touches, maybe a splash of orange juice or a pinch of nutmeg, that made each family's version unique. Sweet potato pie was more than dessert. It was memory, history, and love baked into a single golden circle that brought everyone back for seconds and sometimes even breakfast the next day. Wild persimmon leather served as a natural energy bar long before packaged snacks existed. Fully ripe wild persimmons, soft and honey-sweet, were mashed into a smooth pulp and spread thinly on clean boards or large leaves. Left in the sun to dry or placed near the gentle heat of a hearth, the mixture became a chewy sheet that kept for weeks. This portable treat provided a quick source of calories for long days in the fields and could be tucked into cloth packets for later use. The technique echoed African and indigenous methods of drying fruit to preserve it for travel and winter storage. After emancipation, many rural families continued to make persimmon leather as an autumn tradition, and some Appalachian homesteads still practice it today. Its deep caramel flavor and long shelf life show how ingenuity and patience created foods that were both practical and delicious. Wild persimmon leather stands as a vivid link between past and present, proving that simple preservation can yield enduring taste and nourishment. Buttermilk cornbread baked in cast iron anchored countless suppers with its golden crust and tangy bite. The heavy skillet, seasoned from years of use, gave the bread a flavor impossible to match in a modern pan. Families stirred cornmeal with fresh buttermilk, a little lard, and a pinch of salt, then listened for the satisfying hiss as the batter hit hot iron. The result was a loaf both crisp at the edges and tender inside, perfect for soaking up potlikker from simmered greens or for eating plain with a drizzle of cane syrup. Grandmothers often taught their grandchildren to test the heat of the skillet by flicking in a few drops of water, a small ritual that connected generations. On Sundays after church, the scent of baking cornbread drifted through neighborhoods, promising a meal that united family and friends. Today, prepackaged mixes and quick breads have replaced the slow, careful method that once defined African American kitchens, and the art of true cast-iron cornbread grows rarer with each passing year. Pork fatback and cabbage was a skillet dish that showed how even scraps of pork could bring life to vegetables. Fatback, mostly fat with little meat, rendered down in a hot pan until it sizzled, releasing flavor into the cabbage. My grandmother would slice the cabbage thin and cook it until tender, soaking up the richness from the fat. The result was savory, smoky, and filling, even though it was made from ingredients most considered cheap or undesirable. Families paired it with cornbread or rice, stretching it further into a full supper. It was food that came from thrift, but it carried a taste that lingered long after the plates were cleared. Parched corn coffee was the taste of resilience in a cup. When real coffee was beyond reach, enslaved people roasted corn kernels in iron pans until they turned dark brown, then ground them into a coarse powder and steeped it in hot water. The brew was smoky, earthy, and faintly sweet, a humble echo of the luxury drink denied to them. It offered warmth in the early hours before sunrise, when labor began and the cold bit through thin clothes. Parched corn coffee was both necessity and ritual, a way to face the day with something that felt human, dignified, and shared. It was brewed from what the earth gave freely, proof that comfort could still be created from scarcity. In its bitterness was a taste of endurance, and perhaps quiet defiance too. Cornmeal sacks were as essential as breathing, and every family knew it. Cornmeal was cheap, filling, and dependable, something you could use in a dozen different ways without wasting a single grain. Families used it for cornbread that stretched a pot of beans, hoe cakes cooked right on the stovetop, dumplings dropped into broth, and even as a thickener when soups needed to last another day. The sacks sat in corners of pantries, tied tight to keep pests out, often lasting weeks at a time because people used cornmeal daily. Kids learned early how to scoop it with steady hands, knowing a little went a long way. Cornmeal was the base of survival cooking, humble but mighty. It kept families full when nothing else was guaranteed, proving that simple food could be powerful when stretched with skill and love. Fried green tomatoes were a porch-side favorite, a snack for hot days and easy laughter. Slices of firm green tomatoes were dipped in cornmeal, fried golden in a skillet, and sprinkled with salt while still sizzling. The result was crisp on the outside, soft inside, and just tart enough to make your mouth water. You could eat them standing up, still hot from the pan, or stack them high beside a plate of beans and rice. They were the kind of treat you didn't plan, you just made them when the garden gave too many tomatoes. The pop of oil, the hum of conversation, and the smell of cornmeal frying turned an ordinary afternoon into something special. Kids waited by the stove, stealing pieces when the cook wasn't looking, their fingers burned but happy. Fried green tomatoes weren't just about taste, they were about time, patience, and community. Their taste was bold but humble, a reminder of summers that felt endless and simple pleasures that cost almost nothing. Fried green tomatoes were living proof that good things come to those who cook from the heart. Molasses stack cake was the kind of dessert that carried a sense of occasion. Multiple thin layers of cake, sweetened with rich molasses, were stacked high with spiced apple filling or sorghum syrup spread between them. The layers were assembled in advance, allowing the flavors to meld and the texture to soften into a tender, almost pie-like bite. For African American families in the South, this cake was a way to celebrate with what was on hand, often using sorghum molasses from local mills. It appeared at church suppers, weddings, and holiday feasts, each layer baked carefully and sometimes contributed by different family members. The taste was deep, warm, and slightly tangy, making it distinct from sugar-based cakes. Over time, as refined sugar became more accessible and baking trends shifted, the molasses stack cake faded from everyday kitchens. Yet for those who remember it, the sight of a tall, dark spiced cake still brings back the feeling of a special day when everyone gathered to share. where bananas, pineapple, and warm spices met in a towering creation crowned with cream cheese frosting. Mashed ripe bananas and crushed pineapple gave the batter moisture and gentle sweetness, while cinnamon added a soft heat. Chopped pecans folded through the mix brought welcome crunch. Baked in layers and cooled, the cake was frosted with rich cream cheese icing that clung to every curve. Each slice revealed flecks of fruit and nuts, offering a tropical aroma that felt both festive and comforting. This cake graced wedding receptions, church anniversaries, and milestone birthdays throughout the 1970s, admired for its bold flavor and dramatic presentation. Families cherished it as a special occasion dessert that celebrated abundance and creativity. Hummingbird cake embodied the generous spirit of Southern hospitality, proving that fruit, spice, and a careful hand could produce a showpiece worthy of the grandest table while still carrying the warmth of a lovingly baked homemade treat. Sorrel hibiscus tea brought a ruby glow to church socials and summer porch gatherings. Its tart floral flavor, steeped from dried hibiscus petals and sweetened with cane sugar, reflected Caribbean influences that African American families carried north and west during migrations. Grandmothers brewed the tea in large enamel pots, sometimes adding a hint of ginger or a squeeze of lime to brighten the taste. Children watched the deep red liquid swirl into pitchers, knowing it signaled a special occasion. Served chilled over cracked ice in simple glasses, sorrel tea cooled guests during humid evenings while hymns and laughter filled the air. The drink offered more than refreshment. It was a quiet connection to ancestors and homelands across the sea. Over time, soda and store-bought beverages replaced the careful steeping of petals and spices, and the vibrant tradition faded in many communities. Those who still make it treasure the deep crimson reminder of resilience and shared history that once colored every celebration. Elderflower cordial brought delicate sweetness and subtle healing to kitchens that often lacked sugar and fruit. When elder shrubs burst into fragrant clusters in early summer, gatherers clipped the blossoms and steeped them in water with a touch of honey or sorghum to create a lightly floral syrup. This cordial could be sipped as a soothing drink, stirred into simple desserts, or used as a gentle remedy for coughs and fevers. The method reflected Old World European customs while blending with African American herbal practice, showing how cultures met in the shared search for flavor and wellness. Long after emancipation, elderflower cordial remained a quiet luxury in rural households, prized for its refreshing taste during hot Southern days. Today, it reappears in cocktails and artisanal sodas, but its roots lie in careful foraging and centuries of folk medicine. Elderflower cordial proves that even in times of want, people found ways to capture the fleeting perfume of summer and preserve it for moments of calm and celebration. Boiled sassafras leaves, known later as filet powder, were used long before gumbo became famous. The tender green leaves were gathered fresh, dried in the shade, and pounded to a fine powder that could thicken stews and add an earthy fragrance. It turned thin broths into hearty meals and gave bland grains a taste of forest spice. This tradition, shared by Native and African cooks, was a meeting of survival knowledge, a blending of worlds through food. Filet had the power to transform scraps into something comforting, its smooth texture turning necessity into delicacy. In the rhythm of cooking, the powder became a quiet bridge between cultures, its use spreading through coastal kitchens and inland cabins alike. It was not just seasoning, it was story, memory, and innovation mixed together. Long before the word Creole appeared on recipes, sassafras leaves carried the story of adaptation, of hands working together in the heat of the South. Every pinch of powder was both flavor and history, stirred quietly into the pot and passed down through generations who never forgot its worth, a shared inheritance of creativity born from constraint. Sorghum syrup bottles sat on shelves like dark liquid treasure, thick, sweet, and impossible to waste. This syrup flavored biscuits, drizzled over cornbread, stirred into porridges, and even served as a home remedy for sore throats or coughs. Sorghum lasted far longer than sugar, and cost much less, making it a Depression staple in African American homes. Kids loved dipping biscuits into the bottle's sticky mouth, and elders praised its strength for keeping people going when meals were bare. A single bottle could stretch across weeks, sweetening life in small but powerful ways. Sorghum syrup was flavor, medicine, and comfort wrapped into one. During winters, when fruits were scarce and treats rare, sorghum made plain food feel indulgent. Its deep, earthy sweetness reminded families that even the simplest pantry items could bring warmth, energy, and a sense of steady, grounded survival. Many households kept it close at hand, using it sparingly but lovingly. Knowing that this humble syrup carried generations of tradition, sorghum was the kind of ingredient that hardened people against hunger and softened the edges of hard days, proving sweetness could survive even the toughest times. Souse meat was a cold, tangy delicacy that turned humble pork trimmings into something worth savoring. Often made from a pig's head, trotters, or other cuts rich in collagen, the meat was boiled until tender, pulled from the bone, and then packed into a loaf pan with a briny vinegar and spice mixture. As it cooled, the gelatin-rich broth set into a firm, sliceable terrine that was served chilled. For many African American families in the rural South, this dish was a symbol of thrift and skill, taking what was available and making it delicious. It was often eaten with crackers, bread, or straight from the plate with mustard. The tang of the vinegar, the seasoning, and the rich texture made it stand out, especially during hot weather when lighter meals were preferred. Though it takes time and patience to prepare, souse meat was once a regular sight at kitchen tables and church socials alike. Today, it has nearly vanished from common diets, remembered fondly by those who know the balance of tart, savory, and satisfying in every slice. Sweet potato pie without sugar became an ingenious solution when refined sugar cost more than most families could afford. Black cooks relied on the sweet potatoes' natural sugars, roasting them until their starches converted to sweetness that rivaled any added sugar. The potatoes were mashed smooth, then mixed with a little flour, whatever milk or buttermilk could be spared, and spices like cinnamon or nutmeg if the spice tin held any. This mixture was poured into simple pastry crusts made from lard and flour, then baked until set. The result wasn't as sweet as modern pies, but it carried deep, earthy flavors that spoke of autumn harvests and survival through winter. Sweet potatoes grew abundantly in southern gardens, storing well in root cellars for months after harvest. Families who grew their own could make pies throughout fall and winter, stretching one crop across countless meals. In Black communities, sweet potato pie represented celebration despite poverty, proof that special occasions deserved recognition even when money was absent. Children looked forward to these pies as rare treats, savoring every bite of something that felt luxurious despite humble ingredients through shared sacrifice. The lively kitchens of the 1970s, reminding families that humble ingredients could create extraordinary comfort. Thinly sliced apples were layered with buttered breadcrumbs mixed with brown sugar, cinnamon, and a touch of nutmeg, building sweet and spiced tiers that baked to a golden finish. The slow bake softened the apples until they melted into a fragrant filling while the crumbs on top crisped to a caramelized crunch. Served warm with a splash of cream, the dessert offered deep satisfaction on cool autumn nights or after hearty Sunday suppers. Children loved breaking through the crunchy surface to reach the tender fruit beneath, and adults cherished the way it stretched a few apples into a crowd-pleasing finale. Apple Brown Betty stood as a bridge between generations, a dessert born of scarcity yet beloved in times of plenty, proving that flavor and comfort often come from the simplest acts of layering, baking, and sharing with the people who matter most. Chocolate mayonnaise cake surprised newcomers with its Maypop fruit mash turned the wild passion fruit of the American South into a rare dessert filled with tropical fragrance. Known as maypop for the sound of its hollow fruit when stepped on, this native vine produced aromatic yellow fruits that ripened in late summer. Enslaved foragers gathered the fruit, split the rinds, and scooped the bright pulp into a bowl with a drizzle of molasses or honey when such sweeteners were at hand. The result was a naturally tangy treat that needed no cooking and provided a burst of vitamins. The flavor, a cross between citrus and melon, delighted anyone lucky enough to taste it. Even after emancipation, rural families prized maypops for jellies and pies, and the plant remains a cherished wild edible across the Southeast. Maypop fruit mash preserves a memory of fleeting seasonal abundance and the creativity that transformed wild gifts into moments of celebration, proving that even in the harshest circumstances, people found ways to enjoy the bright, unique flavors offered freely by the natural world. Pickled watermelon rind turned summer scraps into something bright and memorable when waste was never an option. Families peeled the green rinds from sweet watermelons, cut them into strips, and simmered them in a brine of vinegar, sugar, and warm spices until the pieces turned translucent and tender. The finished pickles carried a gentle sweetness with a tart kick that balanced fried fish or smoky barbecued pork. Children often helped pack the jars, laughing as the kitchen filled with the scent of cinnamon and clove. These jars lined pantry shelves and cooled in cellars, ready to brighten winter meals with a taste of summer. For many households, this thrifty condiment was a sign of careful planning and pride in making every harvest last. Today, few people bother to save the rinds, and the recipe hides in old notebooks and fading memories. Yet those who remember speak of the surprising pleasure of that sweet, sour crunch beside a plate of fried catfish. Sorrel leaf steep was a burst of red tang in a world that often offered little color or comfort. Made from dried hibiscus-like leaves, the steep was both drink and medicine, refreshing in heat, cleansing in illness, and joyful in spirit. It came from deep roots in West Africa, where the drink was known as bisap, and it crossed the ocean in memory long before it ever reached American soil. Boiled with ginger or orange peel when available, it turned water into something sacred, bright, and alive. For enslaved people, it was a rare taste of home, a sip that tied them to ancestors and land across the sea. It was tart, strong, and deeply red, the color of endurance itself. Even when made from wild sorrel instead of imported hibiscus, the essence remained the same, a reminder that flavor and identity could not be stripped away, only adapted. In the 1960s, fatback and cabbage was a reminder that flavor did not come from abundance, but from knowing how to cook with care. It was a dish that taught respect for every part of the animal and every leaf from the garden. Pork, fatback, and cabbage turned scraps into sustenance. Vegetable pot pie with biscuit crust was one of the cleverest ways to turn leftovers into a comforting meal. My grandmother gathered whatever vegetables were left from the week, beans, carrots, peas, or turnips, and simmered them in a simple gravy. She poured the mixture into a dish and covered it with biscuit dough instead of pie crust, which baked into a golden, fluffy topping. The result was hearty, filling, and deeply satisfying, stretching scraps into something that felt like a Sunday supper. Each slice carried both thrift and comfort, a reminder that nothing from the kitchen was wasted. The biscuit crust gave the dish substance, making it a true dinner instead of just a side. In the 1960s, vegetable pot pie with biscuit crust was common across homes that relied on ingenuity, turning odds and ends into meals that filled plates and warmed hearts. It was survival, wrapped in comfort, food that told the story of resourceful families making the most of what they had. Collard green Potlikker soup captured the very essence of slow cooking and careful stewardship. After hours of simmering collard greens with smoked meat, the broth left in the pot was a mineral-rich elixir, treasured as much as the greens themselves. Families poured this flavorful liquid into bowls and sipped it with pieces of cornbread, believing it to restore strength and spirit after long days of work. Some added hot pepper vinegar for a lively kick, while others preferred it plain and soothing. Children learned early never to throw away the Potlikker, understanding that its nutrients were too valuable to waste. Neighbors often shared jars with the sick or elderly, turning the simple broth into a gesture of care and healing. Modern kitchens may overlook this tradition, discarding the liquid without thought, but for those who remember, the taste of Potlikker carries the memory of community generosity and the wisdom of using every drop the garden and the kitchen could provide. Cabbage fermented into slaws was a clever way families made vegetables last long past their growing season. When fresh cabbage was cheap and abundant, families shredded it, salted it, packed it into jars or crocks, and let time transform it into something tangy and crisp that held up through bitter winters. This fermentation not only preserved the cabbage but added flavor and nutrients when meals were often plain and repetitive. During the Depression, when fresh greens disappeared quickly, having a jar of fermented slaw meant there was always something bright and sharp to cut through heavy dishes. It brought contrast to beans, cornbread, or stews, and made even the simplest supper feel complete. Kids might wrinkle their noses at the smell, but adults appreciated how far a single head of cabbage could be stretched. Cabbage slaw was survival with personality, tart, lively, and always ready to remind families that good food could still exist in hard times. Pan-fried corn was sunshine in a skillet, sweet, buttery, and golden. Fresh ears were scraped by hand, milk and all, then tossed into hot bacon grease until the kernels popped and sizzled. A sprinkle of salt, a dash of sugar, maybe a touch of pepper. It didn't need much else. The smell filled the kitchen, calling everyone to gather round. Each spoonful had that mix of sweet and savory that only Southern cooks could master. It was summer food, made from corn grown nearby, cooked while the day was still hot and bright. You could eat it by itself or scoop it beside greens and meat, but it always stole the show. The sound of it frying was like music, a melody of comfort and familiarity. It was the kind of dish that turned ordinary days into something to remember. Pan-fried corn was quick to make but impossible to forget, the kind of dish that reminded people that joy could fit inside a cast-iron skillet. Apple brown. Betty was a humble yet satisfying baked dessert made by layering sliced apples with breadcrumbs or pieces of day-old bread, then sprinkling the layers with sugar, cinnamon, and nutmeg. Butter was dotted generously throughout, and the dish was baked until the apples softened and the topping became golden and crisp. It was a resourceful dessert that made use of stale bread that might otherwise be discarded, transforming it into something sweet and comforting. For African American families, especially in rural areas, it was a common treat after Sunday dinners or community gatherings. Served warm, often with a drizzle of cream or a scoop of homemade ice cream, it balanced tart fruitiness with cozy spice and richness. The recipe's simplicity made it accessible to home cooks of all skill levels, and the ingredients were inexpensive and easy to find. While more elaborate pies and cobblers became popular over time, Apple Brown Betty quietly slipped into the background, remembered fondly by those who grew up with its unpretentious charm and the way it filled kitchens with the scent of baking apples and toasted bread. Summer nights and backyard fish fries, a frozen treat that carried a quiet elegance. Fresh cream and milk were cooked gently with sugar until smooth before being churned with toasted pecans and a splash of vanilla. The slow churning created a dense, velvety texture, while the nuts added buttery crunch in every spoonful. Families often gathered around hand-crank ice cream makers, taking turns turning the handle as laughter filled the evening air. When the lid finally lifted, the sight of pale golden ice cream studded with glossy pecans drew cheers from children and adults alike. Served in simple bowls or between two cookies for an impromptu sandwich, it offered both cool relief and a taste of celebration. In African American communities of the 1970s, butter pecan ice cream became a symbol of shared effort and shared joy, proving that homemade desserts always taste sweeter when everyone has a hand in bringing them to life. Hummingbird cake rose to fame from Southern black kitchens. Persimmon seed coffee emerged when imported beans were rare or too costly for enslaved communities. Wild persimmons dropped their fruit in autumn, and the hard seeds inside were washed, dried, and roasted until dark and fragrant. Ground and steeped in hot water, they produced a warm, nutty beverage with no caffeine but plenty of comfort on cold mornings. This practice carried forward after the Civil War, especially during wartime shortages when coffee imports faltered again. Families across the South roasted persimmon seeds alongside chicory or other local substitutes, proving the durability of this inventive method. The gentle flavor and toasty aroma made it a beloved alternative long after necessity faded. Today, a few heritage festivals still brew persimmon seed coffee to honor the ingenuity of those who first discovered its rich taste. The drink reminds us that creativity in the face of scarcity can yield traditions that outlast the circumstances that gave birth to them, turning survival into a legacy of flavor and resilience. Kuni root flour was one of the rarest forms of survival food, pulled from the sandy soils of Florida's coastal woods. The Coanti, or Florida arrowroot, held starch deep within its roots, but it was also toxic until carefully processed. Enslaved people learned to grate the roots, soak them in running water for days, and dry the pulp into a fine powder. The process was laborious and delicate, but the result was precious: a clean, edible flour that could be used in bread, mush, or porridge. It was a carbohydrate reserve for when nothing else remained, sustaining life in times of famine or isolation. Each batch was a victory of knowledge over danger, of patience over hunger. The skill to prepare it safely came from generations of shared wisdom, passed quietly between hands. To turn poison into nourishment was not only survival, it was genius born from necessity. Corn pudding was a smooth, custard-like side dish that showcased the natural sweetness of fresh corn blended with milk, eggs, and butter. Kernels were often scraped straight from the cob, releasing their milky juices before being folded into a simple batter. Some cooks added a spoonful of sugar, while others preferred a more savory approach with salt, pepper, or a dusting of cheese. In African American homes, it was a centerpiece at Sunday dinners, church socials, and holiday feasts, pairing beautifully with roasted meats or fried chicken. Its gentle texture and warm flavor made it appealing to all ages. Prepared in large pans, it could feed many with ease, making it ideal for big families and community gatherings. As boxed mixes and quick side dishes replaced scratch-made recipes, it became rarer, but for those who knew it well, corn pudding remains a beloved reminder of generous tables and heartfelt cooking. Collard green bunches for drying were common because greens grew well, fed many mouths, and could be preserved long after harvest. Families tied them in bundles, hung them in kitchens or porches, and let them dry slowly in the air. These dried leaves were later simmered with whatever seasoning was available, turning into tender, flavorful greens even in the dead of winter when fresh produce was out of reach. Sometimes a scrap of fatback went into the pot, but even when it did not, the greens still tasted like comfort. Every dried bunch felt like a piece of summer tucked away for later. This practice connected generations. Children watched elders hang the bunches, learning quietly how to prepare for the months ahead. It was survival, but also tradition, rooted in memory, skill, and a deep understanding of how to make the land stretch. Peanut soup demonstrated the brilliance of using locally grown legumes to create filling, nutritious meals from almost nothing. Peanuts, grown throughout the South and often harvested by black farmers, were ground into paste and mixed with water, onions, and whatever seasonings could be found. The mixture cooked down into creamy soup that provided protein, fat, and comfort. This wasn't the refined peanut butter soup found in fancy cookbooks. It was rough, grainy, and honest, tasting of earth and survival. Black families made peanut soup regularly because peanuts stored well and could be ground by hand using simple tools. The soup filled hungry children before school and warmed field workers who came home exhausted after dark. In Alabama and Georgia, where peanuts were staple crops, this soup appeared so frequently it became associated with depression hardship. Yet it delivered genuine nutrition. Peanuts provided complete protein and essential fats that kept bodies functioning during starvation conditions with community support. Blackberry dumplings were a summer treat that celebrated the abundance of wild fruit. Blackberries, plucked fresh from brambles along fence lines and fields, were simmered with sugar until they released their juices and became a bubbling, fragrant sauce. Soft dumplings made from biscuit dough were dropped into the pot, absorbing the sweet berry flavor as they cooked. Served warm, often with a splash of cream or a scoop of ice cream, this dessert brought together the tartness of the berries and the comfort of tender dumplings. In African American rural communities, blackberry picking was often a family activity, with children and adults working together to gather enough fruit for pies, jams, and desserts like this. The dumplings stretched the berries into a more filling dish, ensuring everyone could have a generous portion. While store-bought berries are common today, the act of foraging for wild ones and making simple rustic desserts from them has largely disappeared, leaving blackberry dumplings as a delicious memory from a time when seasons shaped the table. Roasted chestnuts carried warmth and nourishment through the cold months when plantation rations were meager and gardens lay dormant. Enslaved families foraged chestnut trees that grew wild in the surrounding woods, gathering the smooth brown nuts and roasting them in hearth ashes or iron skillets until their shells cracked and the sweet flesh softened. The nuts' high energy content and natural sweetness made it an important source of calories and comfort, especially during long winter evenings. Roasted chestnuts became part of a wider African American food tradition, appearing in holiday celebrations and roadside markets after emancipation. Their gentle flavor paired well with cornmeal breads and simple stews, and many families passed down techniques for roasting and storing them long after the plantation era ended. Today, roasted chestnuts sold at winter festivals and city street corners carry echoes of that history, reminding us that what began as a survival practice also nurtured community and seasonal ritual for generations who transformed hardship into enduring culture. Molasses stacked cake graced weddings and homecomings with a sweetness born of patience and skill. Thin layers of spiced cake were baked individually, then stacked high with a rich molasses filling that soaked into the crumb as the dessert rested overnight. The dark syrup lent a deep flavor that spoke of both Caribbean cane fields and southern kitchens. Families often baked the layers days ahead, turning the assembly into a festive gathering where aunts and cousins worked side by side. Each slice told a story of celebration and endurance, for molasses was affordable and plentiful even when other sweeteners were scarce. The cake's tall, impressive stature made it a centerpiece on tables decorated for special occasions, a symbol of abundance even in lean times. Today, few households take the time to roll, bake, and stack so many delicate layers, and the recipe lives mostly in old family cookbooks. Those who have tasted it know the quiet triumph of a dessert that rewards effort with lasting memory. Smoked pumpkin seeds were the quiet miracle of the harvest. Nothing wasted, everything used. After pumpkins were cooked or dried, the seeds were cleaned, salted, and roasted slowly over smoldering coals. Sometimes they were left in the smokehouse overnight, gathering a deep flavor that kept pests away and preserved them for weeks. The seeds were packed in small cloth bags, tucked into pockets for long days in the fields. Rich in oil and protein, they offered strength when meals were light and days were long. The faint smokiness reminded people of autumn fires, of the scent of the earth preparing for rest. They were eaten during pauses between labor, one seed at a time, a tiny comfort against hunger. Mothers handed them to children during chores, teaching them to save what others might throw away. What began as leftovers became sustenance, a reminder that survival was not about abundance, but awareness. Every seed represented the wisdom of thrift, the art of finding nourishment in what others overlooked. In that small handful of smoke and salt was the story of endurance itself, a quiet testament to how even the smallest things could sustain the human spirit. Red drink, Juneteenth punch, flowed like a symbol of freedom and memory at community celebrations marking emancipation. Made from hibiscus petals or bright strawberries steeped into a deep crimson infusion, the drink stood for resilience and the blood of those who fought for liberation. Families would gather in churchyards and town squares, pouring the sweet, tangy liquid into simple cups while music and laughter filled the warm June air. Children chased each other between picnic tables as elders told the story of the first Juneteenth, reminding everyone of the hard-won joy behind the holiday. The punch often carried a gentle spice from cloves or ginger, offering a flavor both refreshing and layered, much like the history it honored. Preparing the drink was as important as drinking it, with women and men alike contributing fruit, sugar, and labor to the cause. Though some communities still keep the tradition alive, many younger generations have never tasted the vibrant red drink that once defined a day of remembrance and celebration. Chinquapin nut cakes offered small moments of sweetness, created from the rich forests of the American South. The chinquapin, a dwarf chestnut native to the region, produced small, sweet nuts that could be eaten raw or roasted. Enslaved families collected these nuts in autumn, cracked their shells, and ground the meat into a fine meal. Mixed with a little cornmeal, honey, or molasses when available, the nut meal formed small cakes that were baked or cooked on a griddle until golden brown. These cakes carried both nutrition and a sense of celebration, providing rare treats for special gatherings. The flavor, slightly sweeter than a chestnut with a buttery finish, became a cherished memory passed down through generations. Even after emancipation, chinquapin nuts remained a prized wild harvest in Appalachian and southern communities, though the trees have grown scarce in modern times. Chinquapin nut cakes remind us of the connection between forest abundance and human creativity, transforming a foraged ingredient into a dessert that honored both the landscape and the people who carefully tended its secrets. 7-Up pound cake brought a bright splash of citrus to African-American dessert tables in the 1970s, turning a simple pantry cake into a potluck legend. Bakers creamed butter and sugar until light, then folded in eggs, flour, and a generous pour of lemon-lime soda that gave the batter an airy lift and a gentle sparkle. As it baked in a heavy bundt pan, the kitchen filled with a sunny scent that promised slices dense yet delicate, with a subtle fizz that only a sweet soda could provide. A drizzle of simple lemon glaze or a dusting of powdered sugar finished it off, but many families served it plain to showcase its golden crumb. At church suppers and neighborhood gatherings, this cake always drew a crowd, admired for its cheerful flavor and the clever use of a common drink. The 7-Up pound cake was more than a dessert. It was a conversation starter and a symbol of creativity, proving that a splash of soda could turn an everyday recipe into a sweet memory worth sharing. Sock It To Me cake arrived at every celebration with a name that made people smile and a swirl of cinnamon sugar that made them swoon. Hog cracklin cornbread was a rich, rustic twist on classic cornbread, baked with golden, crispy pork cracklings scattered throughout the batter. These flavorful bits of pork skin, still clinging to pockets of fat, released bursts of smoky, salty flavor in every bite. The bread itself was made from stone-ground cornmeal mixed with eggs and tangy buttermilk for tenderness. Once a favorite in farming communities, it reflected a tradition where nothing from the hog was wasted. Cracklin cornbread was served with collard greens, beans, or hearty stews, soaking up the flavorful juices. Sometimes it stood alone, eaten warm with butter as a filling snack. Closely linked to hog killing season, it carried the spirit of family gatherings and resourceful cooking. As fewer households raised their own livestock and diets shifted, the tradition faded, but for those who remember, its bold, satisfying bite remains an unforgettable taste of a time when food told a story. Cornmeal sacks were as essential as breathing, and every family knew it. Cornmeal was cheap, filling, and dependable, something you could use in a dozen different ways without wasting a single grain. Families used it for cornbread that stretched a pot of beans, hoe cakes cooked right on the stovetop, dumplings dropped into broth, and even as a thickener when soups needed to last another day. The sacks sat in corners of pantries, tied tight to keep pests out, often lasting weeks at a time because people used cornmeal daily. Kids learned early how to scoop it with steady hands. Knowing a little went a long way. Cornmeal was the base of survival cooking, humble but mighty. It kept families full when nothing else was guaranteed, proving that simple food could be powerful when stretched with skill and love. Salt pork and fatback were the flavor lifelines African-American families depended on when fresh meat was a luxury almost nobody could afford. These salty scraps were bought cheap, kept for months, and used with the kind of resourcefulness only Depression survivors understood. A small piece dropped into a pot of beans or greens transformed the entire dish, turning plain vegetables into something rich enough to make you feel full. The fat melted slowly, coating everything with warmth and depth, stretching flavor farther than any piece of meat ever could. Grandmothers guarded these scraps with seriousness, wrapping them carefully, storing them high, and using them sparingly because they knew exactly how long they needed to last. Even a sliver sizzling in a skillet was enough to bring everyone into the kitchen because the smell alone promised a meal worth waiting for. Salt pork and fatback were not just ingredients, they were survival tools passed down through generations. Field pea and okra succotash was a colorful summer dish that combined the nutty taste of fresh field peas with the silky texture of okra and the sweetness of corn. Cooked gently in butter or with a touch of bacon fat, it celebrated the harvest season, bringing together vegetables that grew abundantly in southern gardens. African American cooks often prepared it for family meals and community gatherings, serving it as a side or a light main dish with cornbread. The blend of textures, from the tender peas to the soft okra, created a satisfying balance, while the corn added bursts of sweetness. This dish reflected a strong connection to the land and the value placed on fresh, seasonal produce. As farming and home gardening declined, the tradition of making succotash with truly fresh ingredients became rarer, turning it into a nostalgic reminder of summer tables and garden-to-plate cooking. Homemade soap bars may not have been food, but they were a survival necessity. Families had to stockpile just as carefully. Made from leftover fat, lye, and whatever fragrance could be spared, these soaps kept families clean when store-bought goods were far too expensive. Cleanliness protected health, prevented illness, and preserved dignity during some of the hardest years in American history. Families often crafted batches big enough to last months. Homemade soap was proof that survival was about more than eating. It was about caring for the home, the body, and the people inside it. The process was time-consuming and sometimes dangerous, yet families still made soap because it meant security. Children learned early how to cure bars in cool rooms, turning messy mixtures into solid blocks of protection. These soaps were crafted out of necessity, but carried love in every bar, ensuring families stayed safe through times when getting sick could mean disaster. Cane top syrup began with the earliest shoots of sugarcane, long before the full harvest. When planters reserved the mature stalks for commercial sugar, enslaved workers cut the tender tops and simmered them slowly, extracting a thin but sweet syrup. This homemade sweetener flavored cornbread, porridge, and hot drinks, adding a rare touch of luxury to daily meals. The technique reflected both African experience with cane and Caribbean methods of small-batch syrup making. After emancipation, many rural families continued to boil cane juice into syrup during the early season, a practice still alive in parts of Louisiana and Florida. The flavor is lighter and grassier than late-season molasses, making it unique among southern sweeteners. Cane top syrup shows how skilled hands transformed what might have been discarded into something valuable, blending cultural knowledge with the natural rhythms of the crop. It stands as a reminder that, even in conditions of deprivation, African American cooks created enduring regional flavors that remain treasured in southern pantries today. Wild muscadine grape jam brought the late summer woods to the breakfast table in a deep purple shine. Children and parents walked along fence lines and wooded edges with baskets in hand, searching for the thick-skinned grapes that thrived in southern heat. Once gathered, the fruit was boiled gently until the skins burst and the pulp softened, filling kitchens with a fragrance that hinted at honey and earth. The juice was strained and mixed with sugar, then cooked again until it thickened into a jam rich enough to spread over biscuits or stir into morning porridge. Families prized each jar, knowing that muscadines grew wild and free, needing only careful hands and patience to become something sweet. In some towns, church groups organized picking days, turning the harvest into a social event where songs and laughter echoed through the vines. Today, supermarket grapes have replaced the wild hunt, and store-bought jams lack the musky depth of fruit ripened under southern sun. But memories of purple-stained fingers still linger in many hearts. Fried green tomatoes with grits was a cheap southern classic that carried both tradition and thrift in every bite. Unripe tomatoes, plucked before they spoiled, were sliced, dredged in cornmeal, and fried until golden in a skillet of hot oil or bacon fat. My grandmother paired them with bowls of creamy grits, the cornmeal base that stretched across countless households for pennies. The tomatoes were tangy and crisp, the grits soft and warm, creating a contrast that satisfied both hunger and taste. It was food that came straight from the garden and pantry, without needing costly additions. Families ate it often in the summer when tomatoes grew in abundance, but it found its way to the table year-round. The combination of fried green tomatoes with grits represented resilience, resourcefulness, and the comfort of tradition. In the 1960s, this meal stood as proof that good food did not depend on wealth, but on knowing how to use what you had wisely. Honey locust pod syrup was one of those rare touches of sweetness that seemed like a miracle when sugar was nothing but a memory. The long brown pods of the honey locust tree were gathered carefully, cracked open, and boiled for hours in iron pots until the liquid turned dark and fragrant. Its taste was faintly like molasses, with notes of smoke and earth, thin but deeply satisfying. It took patience and firewood, two things never easy to spare, but the result brought joy to meals that might otherwise have been plain or bitter. A spoonful in corn porridge or drizzled over ash cakes could make a hard day's labor feel a little less harsh. The syrup's scent filled cabins with warmth, reminding families of better seasons. The pod itself, once discarded by others, became a small miracle of sweetness pulled straight from the land. For the enslaved, sweetness was not just flavor. It was hope, condensed into something they could hold, share, and remember. In every drop of syrup, there was a quiet act of defiance, a way to create comfort when comfort was denied, proof that ingenuity could still make life taste sweet. Evaporated milk cans were the quiet lifesavers that sat in pantries for months without spoiling. Families used them in coffee, mashed potatoes, soups, breads, and especially desserts when fresh dairy was out of reach. The thick, creamy texture made every dish feel richer than the ingredients actually allowed. Sometimes kids took a tiny sip straight from the can, savoring sweetness they seldom tasted. One can could transform a meal. It stretched sauces, softened custards, and held together recipes that would have fallen apart otherwise. During the Depression, evaporated milk was more than a convenience. It was survival disguised as luxury. It allowed families to recreate dishes they remembered from better times, even when money was scarce and ingredients were limited. Its shelf life made it a pantry staple that brought comfort through winter storms, long workdays, and nights when meals needed something special. In many homes, evaporated milk was the ingredient that made food feel complete, turning simple meals into something worth gathering around. Chitlins with vinegar peppers were more than a dish. They were an event. Preparing pig intestines required hours of cleaning and cooking, often becoming a group effort among family members. Once ready, the chitlins were simmered slowly with onions, garlic, and spices until tender, their earthy flavor deepened by the cooking process. To serve, they were topped with tangy vinegar-soaked peppers, cutting through the richness and adding a bright kick. This dish was especially popular in winter months, often tied to holiday celebrations or community gatherings where large pots fed many people. The smell of chitlins cooking was unmistakable, and while some loved it and others turned away, no one could deny its cultural significance. It was a connection to a history of making use of every part of the animal, and to the resilience of cooks who worked with what they had. Today, chitlins with vinegar peppers are rare outside of certain communities, but the tradition lives on in the memories and taste buds of those who grew up with them. Dried pinto beans were one of the first things families stocked up on because they lasted forever, filled bellies fast, and cost next to nothing during a time when every penny mattered. These beans sat quietly in cloth sacks or glass jars on pantry shelves, waiting to turn into something warm and sustaining after long days of trying to get by. Pinto beans did not need much, just water, a little heat, and maybe a scrap of fatback if the kitchen was lucky that week. They simmered slow, softening into a thick pot of comfort that could stretch across several meals, sometimes feeding large families for days. Kids grew up recognizing the familiar smell drifting from the stove, a sign that dinner was going to be simple but steady, the kind of food that kept people moving through hard winters and harder workdays. Pinto beans were survival food, but they were also memory food, tying families together with the quiet understanding that something small and humble could carry you through. They were a backbone ingredient in countless homes because they worked every time, no matter how thin the pantry looked. Dried pinto beans did not just feed families, they steadied them. Okra gumbo with fresh crab told the story of low-country waters and West African roots in every bowl. Thickened by the natural mucilage of okra and deepened with a slow-simmered stock, the stew held blue crab, onions, bell peppers, and fragrant spices that reflected both coastal bounty and ancestral memory. Fishermen brought the catch of the day to markets where cooks bargained for the sweetest crab meat, while home gardeners plucked tender okra pods from vines that thrived in humid summers. The gumbo pot became a gathering place where family and neighbors stood around sharing stories as the aroma of seafood and spice filled the air. Served over rice, each spoonful carried the taste of tides, soil, and a heritage that stretched back across the Atlantic. In modern times, many turned to faster recipes and frozen ingredients, losing the patient layering of flavor that once defined this dish. Yet for those who remember, nothing matches the soulful depth of a true okra gumbo made with freshly caught crab. Stewed chicken backs were one of those meals that turned scraps into sustenance. In the 1960s, the back of the chicken was considered the cheapest cut, with little meat clinging to the bones. My grandmother bought them in bulk, cleaned them, and simmered them for hours with onions, potatoes, and carrots until the broth grew rich and fragrant. The long cooking softened the bits of meat so they slid easily from the bones, creating a meal that was both filling and flavorful. Families served the stew over rice or with cornbread, stretching the broth even further. The dish carried smoky undertones if she added a ham bone or a splash of fatback, but it was nourishing even without extras. What made it memorable was how something so overlooked could still feel satisfying and dignified at the table. Stewed chicken backs reminded families that nothing should be wasted, and even the smallest scraps could anchor a full dinner. It was a meal of patience, thrift, and creativity, proof that the cheapest part of the bird could still feed a household with warmth and pride. Crab shell chowder was a meal made from what others threw away, the bones and shells left behind once the meat was gone. Along the coast, enslaved cooks learned to coax flavor from the emptiest scraps. Cracked crab shells were boiled with onions, herbs, and a bit of cornmeal or rice, creating a savory broth that smelled like the sea. Sometimes a single claw or a sliver of meat might find its way in, but most of the time, it was just shells and salt water transformed into sustenance. The broth was cloudy and briny, but it was warm and filling, enough to stretch for a family. The steam rose from the pot, rich and salty, curling into the air like a whisper of comfort. The shells gave their last bit of flavor to the pot, a final offering before being discarded again. What was once refuse became nourishment through skill and patience. It was the art of survival turned into cuisine, a testament to how deeply people could draw life from what remained after everything else had been taken. In those bowls of crab shell chowder lived resilience, proof that even emptiness could be turned into sustenance when guided by knowledge, hope, and the will to survive. Home-canned peaches and pears were treasures stored away with the care of something sacred. Families spent late summer picking, peeling, and preserving fruit in jars so there would be something sweet to look forward to when winter felt endless. Those jars lined shelves like colorful reminders that better days had existed and would come again. Opening one was an event. Kids listened for the pop, adults smiled, and everyone knew dessert was going to feel special. Sometimes the fruit was eaten straight from the jar, sometimes spooned over cornbread, and sometimes served on holiday tables like it was fine gold. In a world where sweetness was rare, these jars felt like hope preserved in glass. Those fruits stretched holidays, Sundays, and hard nights alike. They brought sunshine into cold kitchens. They were sweetness, literally saved for survival. Hog maw stew was the kind of meal that made the most out of what was available, a true reflection of Southern frugality and resourcefulness. Pork stomach was cleaned thoroughly, stuffed or chopped, and then slow-cooked with potatoes, onions, and seasonings until the flavors melded into a rich, hearty broth. In rural African American kitchens, nothing went to waste, and this dish turned what some might discard into a meal that could feed a large family. It was common to prepare this stew during colder months when hearty meals were most welcome, and the aroma would fill the house long before it was served. The texture was tender, the broth flavorful, and it was often accompanied by cornbread to soak up every drop. Beyond being just food, hogmaw stew was a testament to survival, ingenuity, and the ability to transform humble ingredients into something memorable. Today, it is rare to see it on a menu, yet for those who grew up with it, the taste remains unforgettable, tied to family gatherings, laughter, and a sense of making do with what you had. Pone bread rose as the emergency staple when there was nothing in the house but cornmeal and water. Unlike cornbread that required eggs, milk, and baking powder, pone bread demanded only meal, salt, and liquid mixed into thick batter. The mixture was shaped by hand into flat cakes, then baked on hot griddles or directly in fireplace ashes until crusty outside and dense inside. This wasn't delicate food. It was survival bread that filled stomachs and provided energy when nothing else existed. In rural Black households across the Deep South, mothers made pone bread multiple times daily, the smell of toasting cornmeal signaling that at least there would be something to eat. The bread kept well, lasting several days without going stale, which meant one batch could stretch across many meals. Workers carried pone bread to fields, eating it cold with whatever they could forage: wild onions, dandelion greens, or just salt. Children gnawed on pone bread while doing chores, the dense texture requiring real effort to eat but delivering lasting satisfaction through ancestral knowledge. Okra fritters, also known as okra cakes, offered crisp, golden edges and a tender interior that celebrated the summer garden. Fresh okra pods were chopped fine, mixed with cornmeal, onions, and a dash of pepper, then spooned into hot oil until each patty puffed and browned. Sold at fish fries, church picnics, and traveling fairs, these fritters were easy to eat by hand and full of flavor that tied African heritage to southern soil. The okra gave a subtle sweetness and a soft binding that kept the patties moist while the cornmeal crust provided satisfying crunch. Children waited impatiently beside bubbling skillets, hoping for the first fritter to cool enough to taste. Vendors wrapped them in newspaper cones so families could stroll through evening air scented with music and spice. Modern snack foods have replaced these handcrafted treats, but those who remember the sound of oil popping and the taste of garden-fresh okra know the fritters carried more than flavor. They held the joy of gathering and the pride of turning humble crops into a festival of taste. Cornmeal dumplings in tomato broth were the type of dish that felt simple but filling, carrying both thrift and comfort in every bowl. The broth began with canned or fresh tomatoes, cooked down with onions, garlic, and a touch of seasoning to build a savory base. My grandmother mixed cornmeal with a bit of flour, salt, and water to form small dumplings, dropping them carefully into the bubbling pot. As they simmered, the dumplings softened into tender bites, soaking up the tang of the tomatoes while thickening the stew. The smell alone brought everyone to the kitchen, the blend of corn and tomato promising something hearty without needing meat. Cornmeal was cheap and always on hand, a staple in Black households across the South. Tomato broth was inexpensive too, whether from garden harvests or canned goods bought in bulk. Together, they created a meal that cost next to nothing but filled hungry stomachs with warmth. Cornmeal dumplings in tomato broth turned two of the humblest ingredients into a family staple, proving that frugality and care could produce meals worth remembering. Wild honeycomb keep was as close as survival ever came to sweetness. Finding a hive in the woods was an act of luck and courage. Collecting it required smoke, patience, and hands willing to risk pain. The honeycomb was wrapped in leaves or sealed in clay jars to preserve it for months. A single spoonful could flavor cornmeal, soothe a sore throat, or serve as a child's rare treat. Honey was a healer, a reward, a reminder that even in hardship, nature offered grace. It gleamed golden in dim light, sticky and fragrant, its taste pure as sunlight. For those who endured scarcity, it was a miracle worth protecting. A jar of wild honey was more than food. It was life itself, captured and kept safe for the days when sweetness felt far away. potato pound cake blended the rich earthiness of its namesake vegetable with the classic heft of a traditional pound cake, creating a dessert that felt both familiar and new. Roasted sweet potatoes were pureed and folded into a batter of butter, sugar, eggs, and warm spices, giving the cake a golden hue and moist crumb. Baked in a heavy bundt pan, it emerged fragrant with cinnamon and nutmeg, the crust forming a delicate, sugary edge. Served plain, dusted with powdered sugar, or drizzled with a light glaze, it fit equally well at Sunday dinners or holiday feasts. Families prized the recipe for its ability to stretch a single vegetable into a show-stopping centerpiece. In African American households of the 1970s, sweet potato pound cake stood as a reminder of resourcefulness and tradition, turning a humble root into a dessert worthy of celebration. Each slice offered comfort and pride, proving that heritage and innovation could live side by side on the family dessert table without ever losing their soulful heart. Chess squares, often called gooey butter. Salted fish cakes were savory, pan-fried patties made from rehydrated salted fish mixed with mashed potatoes, onions, and spices. This preservation method had strong ties to African American and Caribbean cooking, where salted cod or other preserved fish were traded and transformed into flavorful meals. The mixture was shaped into cakes and fried until crisp on the outside with a tender, flaky interior. Often served with hot sauce or mustard, they could be eaten at breakfast, lunch, or dinner. The salty richness of the fish blended perfectly with the mild potatoes, while onions added sweetness and texture. In communities far from the coast, salted fish was a pantry staple that lasted for months without refrigeration. Fish cakes were an economical way to stretch limited protein, creating a satisfying dish that combined coastal preservation traditions with Southern comfort cooking, delivering big flavor from simple, enduring ingredients. Dried apples strung on twine were a frugal treat that tasted like sunshine saved for winter. Families sliced apples thin, threaded them onto cotton string, and hung them in warm, dry places until they shriveled into chewy, sweet slices. These dried apples could be eaten plain, tossed into oatmeal, or rehydrated into cobblers and pies when sugar was hard to come by. The flavor was intense, tart, sweet, and comforting all at once. Kids loved sneaking pieces straight from the string, and elders relied on them as a dependable snack during the harshest months. Dried apples were a reminder that even the simplest fruits could be preserved with patience and care. They captured the memory of fall harvests, carrying hints of orchard air into kitchens where fresh fruit had long disappeared. Families took pride in how long their apple strings lasted, measuring the success of the harvest by how many loops hung from rafters. Each slice represented work, foresight, and gratitude. Dried apples were more than food. They were edible memories that brightened even the bleakest winter days. Hoghead cheese, or souse meat, was not fancy food, but it had deep roots in tradition and respect for what you had. Made from the head of the pig, boiled, seasoned, and set in its own broth, it was a dish born from necessity and pride. It was eaten cold, sliced thin, and often shared at the table with crackers and conversation. What others might have thrown away became something flavorful and lasting in the right hands. It spoke of times when wasting food was unthinkable, when every part of the animal was used to honor the work that went into raising it. The smell of it cooking filled the whole house, sharp and strong, but it was the kind of smell that meant good things were coming. When cooled and sliced, it glistened in the light like proof of survival itself. Each piece held a story of long days, careful hands, and families who knew that resourcefulness was its own kind of wealth. Souse meat wasn't about glamour, it was about gratitude. Even if you didn't grow up eating it, the story it told was universal. Make do, make it good, and never take a meal for granted. Sorrel drink was a vibrant, ruby-red beverage that carried both Caribbean heritage and Southern holiday tradition. Made from dried hibiscus petals steeped in boiling water, it had a tart, cranberry-like flavor that was softened with sugar and spiced with cinnamon, cloves, and ginger. For many African American families with Caribbean roots, sorrel was a Christmas season essential, served chilled in tall glasses during festive gatherings. The deep color and fragrant aroma made it as beautiful as it was refreshing. Some recipes added citrus peel for brightness, or even a splash of rum for the adults, creating a drink that could be both celebratory and comforting. Making sorrel was often a family affair, with large batches prepared in advance so the flavors could deepen overnight. While its roots stretch back to West Africa and the Caribbean, sorrel drink became part of African American holiday tables in regions where migration brought culinary traditions together. Today, it is still beloved in some households, but remains largely unknown to those outside the culture, quietly holding its place as a seasonal treasure tied to history, family, and celebration. Flavor and a silky custard that made every bite feel like sunshine. A simple filling of fresh lemon juice, sugar, eggs, and butter, baked into a single crust until the top developed a delicate golden sheen and the center set to a creamy, tangy perfection. The pie cooled to a gentle wobble that invited quick slicing and generous servings. Families loved how the dessert used basic ingredients yet delivered a sophisticated citrus punch, ideal for cutting through rich dinners or heavy holiday spreads. Lemon chess pie brought a welcome spark to church luncheons, family reunions, and Sunday suppers throughout the 1970s. Its zesty aroma filled kitchens with a hint of spring even in the heart of winter, offering comfort and brightness in equal measure. This pie proved that elegance could come from everyday staples, turning lemons and sugar into a memorable finale that refreshed the spirit and left guests asking for the recipe to share and cherish. Buttermilk pie wrapped simple pantry ingredients into a velvety custard. Sweet corn and onion skillet was the kind of dish that came together quickly, made from what the garden and pantry had to offer. Fresh ears of corn, or sometimes canned when the season had passed, were sliced from the cob and tossed into a hot pan with sliced onions. Lard or bacon fat did the work of bringing flavor, sizzling until the onions browned and the corn caramelized. The smell was sweet and smoky, filling the house with a promise of comfort even before the first bite. It was cheap, it was fast, and it was nourishing, the kind of supper that stretched across countless families trying to make ends meet. My grandmother served it with bread or cornbread, letting the skillet's juices soak into every bite. The simplicity was its strength, just vegetables and fat, transformed into something more than the sum of its parts. Sweet corn and onion skillet reminded everyone that even with little, you could still eat well. Sun-cured crawfish tails were a marshland treasure, preserved through sunlight and time. Inland from the coast, those who lived near swamps trapped small crawfish in baskets or woven nets, cooking them over low flames before removing the meat. The tails were spread out on wooden boards and dried in the sun until leathery, ready to last for months. Once rehydrated, they flavored soups, rice, or cornmeal porridge with the taste of the bayou. Each batch was an act of careful labor, salting, drying, guarding from insects, and each handful stored away meant another meal secured. The air around the drying racks smelled faintly of salt and smoke, and the rhythm of turning the tails became almost ritual. This food was both preservation and preparation, a promise against hunger's return. For people who could not rely on markets or steady provisions, this practice was independence made edible. Like fish jerky, it carried both salt and strength, a trace of the water that gave it life. Every preserved crawfish tail was a memory of resourcefulness, a morsel of the marsh turned into endurance, a symbol of self-reliance drawn straight from the earth's edge. Dried pinto beans were one of the first things families stocked up on because they lasted forever, filled bellies fast, and cost next to nothing during a time when every penny mattered. These beans sat quietly in cloth sacks or glass jars on pantry shelves, waiting to turn into something warm and sustaining after long days of trying to get by. Pinto beans did not need much, just water, a little heat, and maybe a scrap of fatback if the kitchen was lucky that week. They simmered slow, softening into a thick pot of comfort that could stretch across several meals, sometimes feeding large families for days. Kids grew up recognizing the familiar smell drifting from the stove, a sign that dinner was going to be simple but steady, the kind of food that kept people moving through hard winters and harder workdays. Pinto beans were survival food, but they were also memory food, tying families together with the quiet understanding that something small and humble could carry you through. They were a backbone ingredient in countless homes because they worked every time, no matter how thin the pantry looked. Dried pinto beans did not just feed families, they steadied them. Chicken feet soup proved that even the most unlikely parts could become nourishing meals through patient cooking. Chicken feet, sold for pennies or given free by farmers, contained collagen that transformed into rich, gelatinous broth after hours of simmering. Black cooks added vegetables, rice, and seasonings to create soups that filled entire families, despite starting with what others considered garbage. The feet's cartilage and tendons broke down into silky broth that coated the mouth and provided genuine satisfaction. This soup appeared regularly in both urban and rural Black households, the feet's low cost making them accessible even during the worst Depression years. Children learned to navigate around bones, finding bits of meat and skin while appreciating the rich broth. The practice of using chicken feet showed respect for animals and refusal to waste anything edible. In Chinese and Black communities, chicken feet were prized ingredients rather than trash, cultural knowledge preserving their value. The soup delivered protein, minerals from bones, and warmth that comforted as much as it nourished despite impossible odds. Which 1960s recipe deserves a revival in your kitchen? Share your family's stories and dishes in the comments, hit that like button, and subscribe so you never miss another tribute to the soul food traditions that shaped a generation.